Throughout time, people across the world told each other tales of how they came to be, of heroes and monsters, romance and tragedy, death and rebirth. Mythology helped shape the ancient world, explaining the unexplainable. This is Mythology Unleashed. Nestled on the shores of Lake Michigan stands the city of Chicago, Illinois. Affectionately referred to as the Windy City, Chicago is one of the most populous cities in America, rich with culture grown from a colorful history, an epicenter filled with achievements in everything from arts and music, to cuisine and architecture, to industry and transportation. Baked within Chicago's culture are a plethora of urban legends and city myths. Legends of the undead, vengeful spirits and wailing apparitions, blood-drinking monsters, spectral sights, even beasts that defy explanation are said to haunt the city streets and nighttime rooftops. This program will discuss a handful of the most prevailing and outright bizarre legends of Chicago. Our first legend is Chicago's very own hitchhiking ghost, a beautiful young blonde woman in a white 1920s party dress, who goes by the name of Resurrection Mary. There are a number of different tales as to how this ghost came to be, but perhaps the most prevalent describes Mary as once a beautiful young woman living in the late 1920s who had attended a dance with her boyfriend. Later on in the night, the young couple got into a heated argument, and Mary decided to walk home in the rain, a decision that would prove fatal. She marched on through the storm, down Archer Avenue in her white gown when, between the O. Henry Ballroom and the Resurrection Cemetery, she was struck down and killed by a car. The driver of the vehicle was never identified, and the driver left Mary to die on the side of the road. In the decades that followed, countless people in Chicago have seen Resurrection Mary out and about at night, hitchhiking on Archer Avenue, lamenting in Resurrection Cemetery, or frequenting the various nightclubs of the city. Like many other hitchhiking ghosts, Resurrection Mary would gladly accept the offer of a ride. But when the car would pass the cemetery where she was buried, she would then vanish without a trace, save for the unnerving chill that she would leave behind. Just outside of Chicago, in Hillside, exists Mount Carmel Cemetery, the burial place of the likes of Al Capone and Dion O'Banion, and the haunting grounds of the Italian Bride. In life, the woman who would one day be known as the Italian Bride was Giulia Boccola Fetta, who died in 1921 during childbirth. Giulia was buried in her wedding dress, her stillborn son Filippo held in her arms. But in the following months, Giulia's mother, Filomena, began to have recurring nightmares of her daughter, pleading desperate cries of being buried alive. After 6 years of the nightmare, and after several failed attempts to do so, Filomena had Giulia's grave exhumed, where all present were shocked to find that even after 6 years of being dead, her corpse had hardly decayed at all. Though today this can be explained by embalming fluids in use at the time, but back then, it was said that Giulia's soul, and thus her body, were incorruptible and would never rot away. An elaborate statue of the deceased woman was erected at her burial site, while reports of a dark-haired ghost woman in a flowing wedding dress wandering the cemetery, both during the day and at night, began to circulate throughout the county. Many believe that this spectral bride is in fact Giulia Boccola Fetta, the Italian Bride, whose spirit lives on as her body refuses to decompose. Though a chilling figure, she seems to be protective of wayward children, with one eerie story telling of a boy accidentally left behind by his family, who upon returning to get their son, saw him holding hands with a pale woman in a wedding gown, who then suddenly vanished from sight. Legends of ghost ships appear in every settlement near a large body of water, and in the case of the Chicago River, its resident ghastly vessel is the SS Eastland. On July 24, 1915, the SS Eastland was moored along the Chicago River downtown, scheduled to carry passengers to an annual picnic for the Western Electric Company in Cicero. But as the steamship's capacity was reaching its peak, the top-heavy ship began to sway back and forth, lightly at first, and then more violently, before it finally tipped over on its port side, in front of many horrified spectators, hurling passengers from the top deck and into the river, their heavy suits and gowns weighing them down into the waters, drowning them. Meanwhile, within the ship's lower levels, countless people were trapped, scrambling to get out of the water. But it was too late for many. Less than an hour after boarding commenced, 844 people had died, while the rest either managed to swim to shore or had been rescued by first responders and brave souls. In the years that followed, reports of great splashes and horrifying screams emanating from the Chicago River at night became rampant. Some even say that on foggy nights, if one looks out to that section of the river, they may see the ghostly figure of the SS Eastland, still waiting to leave the port. And what's more, some even say that they may see the phantom faces of the deceased looking up from the watery depths, and may even reach out with grasping hands and pull onlookers down into a watery grave. Chicago receives many visitors every day of the year, but one of which is a famous cryptid whose legend was born many miles away from the Windy City: Mothman. Though Mothman's legend began in the town of Point Pleasant, West Virginia in the late 1960s, reports of Mothman, or a similar winged creature, swirled in Chicago for decades, all the way to the modern day. As with the original Mothman, Chicago's variant is an imposing humanoid, dark in color, with a massive wingspan, and huge glowing red eyes that seem to stare into your very soul. But what separates Chicago's Mothman from Point Pleasant's is a somewhat more foreboding presence, and even more bat-like features, not unlike the classic image of a gargoyle. What's more is that some of the reports claim to have seen not one, but a whole cluster of these alleged Mothmen lurking in the parks and dimly lit areas of the city after dark. So it begs the question, is the Chicago Mothman the same creature that haunted Point Pleasant back in the 1960s? Is it a distant relative? And are there more than one? Too many questions, and too few answers. The High Bridge was a 4-story bridge that spanned over Lincoln Park Lagoon in the late 19th century. It garnered a dark reputation for being the choice spot for those lost and suffering to end their lives, earning it the nickname Suicide Bridge. After a slew of deaths and attempts, and a number of issues regarding disrepair, the bridge was torn down in 1919. But in the years the bridge had existed, and the years that followed its demolition, a number of supernatural occurrences were said to take place in the vicinity where the bridge once stood. Ghosts of victims, full-body apparitions, and phantom shades in the night were said to haunt the park, staring up at the bridge or down from its rails, perpetually repeating their fateful jumps, their mournful cries echoing throughout the night. By February of 1898, sightings of ghosts in Lincoln Park became widespread, to the point that police officers on night watch in Lincoln Park were begging for transfers because of the strange experiences they were having on duty. To this very day, there is something unnaturally chilling about Lincoln Park once the sun goes down. Another denizen of the undead said to haunt Chicago is the Lakeview Vampire. In 1888, long after most vampire hysteria in both America and Europe had significantly decreased, stories of a vampire stalking victims in the Windy City started to grow, mostly due to Justice of the Peace Albert Thalstrom discussing vampire lore as fact to anyone who would listen. His words were further enforced by Civil War veteran Samuel Patton, who claimed he had been hunted by a vampire since the war came to a close, and his children had been killed by demonic spirits. Soon word spread that at least one vampire was lurking in the area of Lincoln Park. And then, that November, a man named Claes Larson had gone missing after spending a night out drinking. After staying up all night waiting for him, Larson's wife proclaimed her husband was killed by the Lakeview Vampire. As word spread, a search for the man was declared, turning up a tattered shirt and blood-stained boot. This prompted a group of local children to hunt for the vampire all through Lincoln Park. But a few days later, Larson returned home, unharmed, and completely unaware that his absence incited a vampire scare. So the legend of the Lakeview Vampire died out, though it is far from the only legend concerning the dead circulating from Lincoln Park. Our final legend of this program once again focuses on the dead in Lincoln Park, or rather, beneath it. Since the 1800s, a sizable amount of land in what would one day become Lincoln Park was a burial ground up until the land's conversion from a cemetery into a park in the mid-1860s. The city's officials implored many citizens to have the bodies of their deceased family members moved, along with the tombstones and grave markers. Though many complied with the ordinances, it is strongly believed that many had not. As there is no way to prove it without digging up a massive area of the park, legend has it that beneath Lincoln Park, where children run and play and adults engage in outdoor recreation, there exist the skeletal remains of thousands upon thousands of dead bodies. The number of alleged corpses varies from source to source, with numbers ranging from 10,000 to nearly 40,000. But what is generally agreed upon by those who know of the skeletons is that if all of the buried corpses of Lincoln Park were to stand up all at once, Chicago would have a severe population problem. No town or city, no matter how urban in design, is found wanting in legends and urban myths, not even a bustling metropolis such as Chicago, Illinois. Though Chicago is noted for its grand achievements in business and culture, and for its event-filled history, the Windy City has more than its fair share of folklore. Tales of ghosts and spirits of hapless victims, monsters taking to the skies and hunting the unwary after dark, and macabre legends that seem to never cease, even with evidence to the contrary. Should you find yourself wandering among the skyscrapers and grand parks of Chicago, Be sure to soak in the culture and history all around you. And be mindful of wayward ghosts.